Settle in. But before we get started, give this video a like and subscribe if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? The city breathes in the cold. New York, December 12, 1910, a metropolis caught between centuries, its skyline clawing upward, its avenues pulsing with the ambitions of a new era. The morning is crisp, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Horse-drawn carriages rattle along the cobblestones, their wheels hissing over patches of ice. Steam billows from manhole covers, curling around the ankles of hurried men in heavy coats and women in fur-trimmed hats. Fifth Avenue is a river of commerce and privilege, its storefronts glittering with holiday displays, its sidewalks crowded with the city's fortunate and its hopeful. On East 79th Street, in a stately brownstone set back from the avenue, a family of distinction begins its day. The Arnolds are old money, perfume importers, their name whispered with respect in drawing rooms and at charity balls. Their eldest daughter, Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, stands at her bedroom window, watching the city awaken. She is 25, tall and elegant, her dark hair pinned with the precision of a society debutante. The room around her is orderly, almost austere, a writing desk scattered with rejection slips, a wardrobe of tailored dresses, a stack of books that hint at private ambitions. Dorothy's world is one of expectation and restraint. She is a Wellesley graduate, fluent in French, a fixture at luncheons and teas, but beneath the surface, she carries the invisible weight of disappointment. Her literary dreams have foundered on the shoals of polite rejection. Her stories, turned away by the editors of Harper's and McClure's, are hidden in a drawer. She has told no one, not her mother, not her father, not even her closest friends, of the sting of failure. In this house, appearances are everything. The morning unfolds with the quiet choreography of privilege. Downstairs, the cook prepares breakfast. The butler polishes the silver. Dorothy descends the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. She enters the dining room, where her mother, Mary Arnold, sits reading the society pages. Her father, Francis, is already at his office, overseeing the family business. Dorothy's younger brother, John, is away at Harvard. The house feels both spacious and confining, its silence broken only by the ticking of a clock. "I'm going shopping," Dorothy announces, her voice composed. She wears a blue tailored suit, a matching velvet hat, gloves, and a sable muff. She carries a small purse, just enough for the day's errands. Her mother looks up, her expression mildly distracted. "Will you be home for luncheon?" Mary asks. "Yes, Mother. I'll be back by 1." There is nothing remarkable in the exchange. No hint of finality. Dorothy steps out into the cold, her breath hanging in the air, and turns toward Fifth Avenue. The city swallows her, a solitary figure moving through a crowd. The streets are alive with possibility. Dorothy walks with purpose, her heels clicking smartly against the pavement. She passes the familiar landmarks, the Metropolitan Museum, the mansions of the Vanderbilts and Astors, the shop windows filled with imported perfumes and Parisian gowns. She is seen, briefly, by the doorman at her building, who nods in recognition. She is seen again by a neighbor, who notes her determined stride. At Brentano's bookstore, Dorothy lingers over the latest titles, selecting a volume of humorous essays. She chats with the clerk, her manner friendly but reserved. She leaves the shop, book in hand, and continues south along Fifth Avenue. At Park and Tilford, she purchases a box of chocolates, a small indulgence. The clerk will later recall nothing unusual, a polite young woman, well-dressed, unhurried. At 1:45 p.m., Dorothy encounters Gladys King, an acquaintance from her social circle. Their conversation is brief. "Are you walking home?" Gladys asks. "Yes, I think I'll cut through Central Park." "It's such a lovely day," Dorothy replies, smiling. It is the last confirmed sighting of Dorothy Arnold. The city moves on, indifferent. The afternoon darkens. Dorothy does not return for luncheon. She does not return for supper. By evening, the Arnold household is uneasy, but not yet alarmed. Dorothy is a grown woman, after all, with friends and obligations. Perhaps she has been delayed. Perhaps she has stopped to visit someone. The hours pass. The city's lights flicker on, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted streets. Night falls. Dorothy's bedroom remains untouched. Her bed is neatly made, her belongings undisturbed. Her mother paces the drawing room, glancing at the clock. The servants exchange worried glances. Outside, the city is blanketed in silence, the only sound the distant clang of a streetcar bell. By midnight, anxiety has curdled into dread. Francis Arnold returns home, his face drawn and pale. The family gathers in the parlor, their voices hushed. She would have sent word, Mary insists, her hands trembling. Francis says nothing. He stares into the fire, his mind racing through possibilities he cannot bring himself to voice. Upstairs, in the darkness of her room, Dorothy's absence is a presence, a void that expands with each passing hour. The city outside is oblivious, its rhythms unchanged. But within the walls of the Arnold home, a nightmare has begun. In the days to come, the story of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance will grip New York. It will become a riddle that confounds detectives, a scandal that threatens the family's reputation, a mystery that haunts the city for generations. But on this night, in the cold heart of winter, it is simply the story of a daughter who did not come home. And somewhere, in the labyrinth of streets and secrets, Dorothy Arnold is gone, swallowed by the city, leaving behind only questions and the faintest trace of perfume on the winter air. The Arnolds were not just a family. They were an institution, a fixture of New York's upper crust whose name opened doors and whose reputation was both shield and sword in the city's relentless social wars. Their brownstone on East 79th Street stood as a monument to old money, its facade dignified but unostentatious, its interiors curated to project an image of taste, tradition, and unassailable respectability. The patriarch, Francis Rose Arnold, was a man of commerce and discretion, his fortune built on the importing and blending of perfumes, exotic oils from the Levant, delicate essences from the fields of Grasse. He was known for his business acumen and his reticence, a man who preferred the quiet of his study to the noise of the ballroom, who believed that true power was exercised in silence, behind closed doors, with a word or a glance. His wife, Mary Augusta Arnold, was the embodiment of Edwardian grace. She moved through the city's social landscape with practiced poise, her every gesture calibrated to maintain the family's standing. She hosted teas for the Ladies' Auxiliary, attended charity galas at the Metropolitan, and presided over her household with a gentle but unyielding authority. Her standards were exacting. Her love, though genuine, was expressed through expectations, a belief that the Arnold name carried with it not just privilege, but duty. Into this world was born Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, their eldest daughter, in 1885. From her earliest days, Dorothy was a child marked by the quiet pressure of legacy. Her education was a matter of family pride, private tutors in French and Latin, summers in Newport, and, finally, Wellesley College, where she distinguished herself not only by her intellect, but by her wit and independence. She was tall, striking, with a thoughtful gaze that hinted at a restless mind. Yet for all her accomplishments, Dorothy was never allowed to forget that she was, above all, an Arnold. The family's expectations pressed upon her like the weight of the city itself. There were rules, spoken and unspoken. How to dress, how to speak, how to conduct oneself at table and in public. There were obligations to attend, luncheons, musicales, charity auctions, where Dorothy was expected to represent her family with dignity and charm. Her mother, Mary, would remind her, "Remember who you are, Dorothy. You are an Arnold." It was both reassurance and warning. Francis Arnold, for his part, loved his daughter in the way of men of his generation, quietly, from a distance, with the hope that she would one day marry well and bring further honor to the family name. He admired her intellect, but he did not understand her ambitions. The world of letters, of literary salons and magazine editors, was foreign to him. He believed in practicalities, business, marriage, property. He provided Dorothy with every material comfort, but he could not give her the freedom she craved. Dorothy's younger brother, John, was away at Harvard, preparing to take his place in the family business. He was the heir apparent, the focus of Frances's hopes and plans. Dorothy, meanwhile, occupied a more ambiguous position, celebrated for her accomplishments, but subtly reminded that her true role was to marry, to host, to perpetuate the family's social standing. It was in this atmosphere of privilege and pressure that Dorothy's literary ambitions took root. She wrote in secret, composing stories and essays late at night, her lamp burning long after the rest of the house had gone dark. She submitted her work to magazines, Harper's, McClure's, The Atlantic, always under a pseudonym, always with the hope that she might be judged on her merits, not her name. The rejections, when they came, were devastating. She hid them from her family, burying the slips in the back of her desk drawer, determined not to show weakness. Yet for all her independence, Dorothy was not immune to the values of her class. She attended the dances, wore the latest fashions, exchanged pleasantries with the sons and daughters of other prominent families. She played her part, even as she chafed against its constraints. Her friends admired her wit and her intelligence, but they sensed, too, a certain reserve, a distance that set her apart. The Arnolds, for their part, were proud of Dorothy, but their pride was conditional. They celebrated her academic achievements, but they did not understand her desire to write. They encouraged her social successes, but they discouraged any talk of careers or independence. For Frances and Mary Arnold, the world was changing too quickly. They clung to the old ways, to the belief that a woman's place was in the home, her ambitions subsumed to those of her family. This tension between tradition and modernity, between duty and desire, defined Dorothy's existence. She was a woman of her time, caught between the expectations of her parents and the possibilities of a new century. She longed for recognition, for the freedom to pursue her own path, but she was bound by ties of loyalty and love. The pressure was relentless. Every morning, Dorothy dressed with care, mindful of the image she projected. Every afternoon, she attended to the obligations of her class, calls, teas, charity work. Every evening, she dined with her family, her conversation measured, her opinions carefully expressed. She was, in every sense, a daughter of distinction. Yet beneath the surface, Dorothy struggled. The weight of expectation pressed upon her, shaping her choices, constraining her dreams. She confided in her diary, in letters to trusted friends, but she could not bring herself to confront her parents. To do so would be to risk their disappointment, their disapproval, a fate she could not bear. The city outside was changing. Women were beginning to assert themselves, to demand the right to vote, to work, to live on their own terms. Dorothy read about these women in the newspapers, admired their courage, but she did not see herself among them. She was an Arnold, and that meant something she could neither fully embrace nor entirely escape. In the end, it was this conflict between the world she knew and the world she desired that defined Dorothy Arnold's life. She was a woman of distinction, a daughter of privilege, but she was also a prisoner of her family's expectations. Her disappearance would become a national mystery, but for those who knew her, it was the inevitable result of a lifetime spent balancing on the edge of possibility and duty. And so, as the city moved inexorably forward, the Arnolds remained, pillars of New York society, their name a byword for respectability and restraint. But behind the closed doors of their brownstone, a different story played out, a story of ambition, frustration, and the quiet desperation that comes from living a life defined by others. The disappearance of Dorothy Arnold would shatter the illusion of security, exposing the fault lines that ran beneath the surface of even the most distinguished families. Dorothy Arnold's days were a careful performance, every gesture and word measured for the benefit of her family and the world they inhabited. But beneath the surface, behind the polite smiles and the tailored dresses, she lived a secret life, one that pulsed with longing and disappointment, with ambition and quiet humiliation. In the privacy of her bedroom, after the city's noise had faded and the glow of gaslight flickered against the walls, Dorothy would sit at her small writing desk, pen poised above a blank sheet, and pour herself into stories and essays that she dared not share with those who knew her best. She was, by all outward appearances, the model of a well-bred Edwardian daughter, a graduate of Wellesley College, fluent in French, skilled at the piano, and always present at the right teas and charity luncheons. But Dorothy's true passion was writing. She dreamed of seeing her name in print, of contributing to the great literary magazines of the day, Harper's, McClure's, The Atlantic. She read voraciously, devouring the works of Edith Wharton and Henry James, and composed her own stories in the margins of her busy social calendar. Yet the world of publishing was not kind to young women of her class, and certainly not to those who dared to write under their own names. Dorothy submitted her stories under pseudonyms, hoping to be judged on merit rather than pedigree, but the rejection slips came all the same, polite, impersonal, and devastating. Each envelope that arrived bore the weight of another closed door, another reminder that her dreams were, perhaps, not meant for someone like her. She kept these failures hidden from her family. Her father, Francis, believed in practical pursuits and saw little value in literary ambition. Her mother, Mary, was proud of Dorothy's education but expected her to settle into marriage and society life. To admit her rejections would be to admit weakness, to expose a vulnerability she could not afford. Instead, Dorothy maintained the illusion of contentment, smiling through dinners and social events, her secret disappointments buried beneath layers of decorum. There were a few, however, who glimpsed the real Dorothy. To her closest friends, women she had known since school, confidants who understood the pressures of their shared world, she confided her frustrations and hopes. In letters written late at night, she poured out her heart. "I feel sometimes as if I am living someone else's life, as if the person they see is only a shadow of who I might be." She wrote of her longing for independence, her desire to create something lasting, and the sting of each rejection that arrived in the Morning Post. One friend, Elsie Henry, recalled years later how Dorothy would read her stories aloud in hushed tones, her voice trembling with both pride and fear. She was so clever, so full of ideas, Elsie remembered, but she was also terribly afraid of disappointing her parents. She wanted so much to be taken seriously, to be more than just another society girl. Dorothy's secret life was not only one of literary ambition. It was also a life of emotional complexity, of longing for connection and understanding. She had fallen in love, improbably, inconveniently, with George Griscom Jr., a man her parents disapproved of. Their relationship was conducted in whispers and clandestine meetings, another secret layered atop the first. In her writing, Dorothy explored these feelings of isolation and yearning, crafting characters who struggled against the confines of their world. But the walls of her existence were high, and the consequences of transgression severe. To be discovered as a failed writer, or as a woman in love with the wrong man, would be to invite scandal and disgrace. And so Dorothy lived in two worlds, the visible world of society and family, and the invisible world of her own making, where she could be honest, vulnerable, and free. The strain of this double life took its toll. Dorothy's letters grew more despondent as the rejections mounted, her sense of isolation deepening. She began to question her own worth, to wonder if her dreams were foolish, if she was destined always to disappoint those she loved. Yet she could not stop writing. It was, in many ways, her only solace, the one place where she could be herself. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy was seen less often at social events, her demeanor more subdued. Friends noticed the change but attributed it to the winter gloom, to the pressures of the season. Only those closest to her suspected the truth, that beneath the surface, Dorothy was struggling, caught between the life she was expected to lead and the life she longed for. On the morning she vanished, Dorothy left her house with the same careful composure she had always shown. But as she walked through the city, her mind must have been crowded with thoughts of failure and hope, of secrets kept and dreams deferred. The rejection slips hidden in her desk, the unfinished stories, the letters to friends, all were silent witnesses to a life lived in the shadows. Dorothy Arnold's secret life was, in the end, a life of yearning. A yearning for recognition, for love, for the freedom to be herself. It was a life that few understood, and one that would remain, even after her disappearance, a mystery at the heart of the case. The world would remember Dorothy as the vanished heiress, the subject of headlines and speculation. But those who knew her best would remember her as a woman who dared to dream, and who paid the price for her ambitions in silence and solitude. December 12, 1910, dawned with a chill that seemed to sharpen the city's edges. The sky was a pale, wintry blue, and Fifth Avenue bustled with the energy of a metropolis in its prime. Carriages and early automobiles jostled for space, the air filled with the scents of roasting chestnuts and the faint, distant perfume from the Arnold family's own warehouses. Dorothy Arnold emerged from her family's brownstone, her coat buttoned tight against the cold, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She was, as always, impeccably dressed. Her blue tailored suit in velvet had a quiet declaration of status, her gloves and muff both practical and elegant. To the doorman, she offered a polite nod. To the city, she presented the face of composure, the mask of belonging. She moved through the morning crowds with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life in these streets. The shops along Fifth Avenue glittered with holiday displays, their windows filled with imported toys and Parisian gowns, the sidewalks alive with shoppers and delivery boys. Dorothy's first stop was Brentano's bookstore, a favorite haunt for the city's literati and socialites alike. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of new paper and ink, the hush broken only by the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of pages. Dorothy browsed the shelves with a practiced eye, pausing at the latest titles, her gloved fingers trailing over the spines. She selected a slim volume. The House of Mirth had been a recent favorite, but today she chose a book of humorous essays, something light to lift the winter glow. The clerk, recognizing her as a regular, offered a courteous smile. "Good morning, Miss Arnold. Will this be all today?" Dorothy nodded, returning the smile with one of her own, a smile that, to the casual observer, revealed nothing of the anxieties that churned beneath her calm exterior. She paid in cash, tucking the book into her purse, and stepped back out into the cold. From Brentano's, she made her way south, the city's pulse quickening as the day wore on. At Park and Tilford, she purchased a small box of chocolates, an indulgence, perhaps, or a gift for someone she would never meet. The clerk would later remember her as pleasant, unhurried, and alone. There was nothing, he insisted, to suggest that she was in distress. It was just before 2 o'clock when Dorothy encountered Gladys King, an acquaintance from her social circle. The two women greeted each other with the polite warmth expected of their class, exchanging pleasantries as the city moved around them. "Are you walking home?" Gladys asked, glancing at the book in Dorothy's hand. Dorothy smiled, her eyes bright. "Yes, I think I'll cut through Central Park. It's such a lovely day." To Gladys, there was nothing unusual in Dorothy's demeanor, no hint of anxiety or haste, no sign that anything was amiss. They parted with a wave, each woman swallowed by the crowd. That single sentence, "I'm going to walk home through Central Park," would become the last confirmed word spoken by Dorothy Arnold. After that moment, she vanished, leaving behind only questions. The city, indifferent and immense, continued on. Dorothy's figure disappeared into the flow of pedestrians, her blue coat and velvet hat blending with the season's fashions. Somewhere between the bookstore and her family's brownstone, between the world of privilege and the anonymity of the city, Dorothy Arnold ceased to exist in the eyes of those who knew her. The hours passed. The winter sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the park's winding paths. By evening, the city's lights flickered on, illuminating empty benches and silent statues. There were no witnesses, no cries for help, no sign of struggle, only the echo of footsteps on frozen ground, fading into silence. Dorothy was never seen again. Her disappearance would become one of New York's great unsolved mysteries, a riddle that would confound detectives, torment her family, and capture the imagination of a city obsessed with its own secrets. But on that day, in the brief, bright hours before dusk, Dorothy Arnold was simply a young woman walking home, a daughter, a dreamer, a ghost in the making. Night fell over the Arnold household with a hush that seemed to press against the windows, the city's distant clatter muffled by thick velvet drapes, and the heavy silence of expectation. The lamps glowed softly in the parlor, casting long shadows across the polished floors and the gilt-framed portraits of ancestors who looked down with solemn, unyielding eyes. In her room, Dorothy's bed remained untouched, the coverlet smooth, her pillow uncreased. Her writing desk sat in the corner, a few sheets of notepaper stacked neatly beside a fountain pen, the ink bottle capped, the latest rejection slip tucked away in a drawer, hidden, as always, from any prying eyes. Mary Arnold, accustomed to the rhythms of her daughter's comings and goings, felt no immediate alarm. Dorothy was independent, after all, and it was not unusual for her to linger at a friend's house or to attend a late luncheon. The city was, to the Arnolds, both playground and fortress, a place of endless engagements, but also one where their name carried weight and doors opened easily. Mary finished her evening tea, her mind drifting over the day's correspondence and the next week's social calendar. She imagined Dorothy laughing with friends in some warm, lamplit parlor, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her voice bright with the easy confidence of youth. As the hours slipped by, the house settled into its nightly routine. The servants retired to their quarters, the butler checked the locks, and the cook banked the kitchen fire. Francis Arnold returned late from his club, his footsteps echoing in the front hall. He paused at the base of the staircase, glancing up toward Dorothy's closed door, but thought nothing of it. His daughter was a grown woman, responsible and sensible. He trusted her judgment, even if he did not always understand her moods. Upstairs, Dorothy's room was a study in order and restraint. Her wardrobe, doors closed, concealed the season's latest fashions, each dress carefully hung and spaced. On her dresser sat a silver-backed brush, a small bottle of perfume, and a photograph of her brother John, smiling in his Harvard cap and gown. The room bore no sign of haste or disturbance. There were no footprints on the carpet, no discarded gloves or hat, no evidence that Dorothy had returned at all. As midnight approached, a thin anxiety began to thread its way through the household. Mary paced the length of the upstairs hallway, pausing at Dorothy's door, listening for the familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft click of the latch. When none came, she told herself that Dorothy must have been delayed, that a friend's invitation had simply run longer than expected. She left a lamp burning in the window, a silent beacon in the night. But as the city's clocks tolled one, then two, unease hardened into worry. Francis, usually unflappable, began to pace the parlor, his brow furrowed in thought. He sent the butler to inquire at the homes of Dorothy's closest friends, but each reported the same. They had not seen her since the afternoon. The telephone, a new and still novel device, was used to call a handful of acquaintances, but no one had news. By dawn, the Arnold home was gripped by a quiet dread. The city outside stirred to life, carriages rattling along the avenue, but inside, time seemed to slow. The servants whispered in the kitchen, casting anxious glances up the stairs. Mary sat in the parlor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. Francis retreated to his study, where he stared at the morning paper without seeing the words. Dorothy's room remained exactly as she had left it, a tableau of absence. The bed unslept in, the air faintly scented with lavender and ink. Her coat and hat were missing, but nothing else. Her purse, the one she had carried that day, was gone. There were no notes, no messages, no sign of intention or farewell. The hours dragged on, each one deepening the sense of unreality that had settled over the house. Mary replayed the morning in her mind, searching for some clue she might have missed, a tone in Dorothy's voice, a lingering glance, a hesitation at the door. But there was nothing. Dorothy had simply stepped out into the city and vanished. By late morning, the anxiety that had gnawed at the edges of Mary's composure erupted into panic. She insisted that Francis contact the police, but he demurred, wary of scandal. Instead, he summoned a private detective, instructing him to be discreet, to keep the matter out of the newspapers. The family's reputation was at stake, and Francis would not have it tarnished by gossip or speculation. Still, as the day wore on and no word came, dread settled over the Arnold home like a shroud. The rooms felt colder, the silence heavier. Every sound, a knock at the door, the ring of the telephone, sent a jolt of hope through the household, only to be dashed by disappointment. Dorothy's empty room became the center of their world, a shrine to uncertainty. Her possessions, so carefully arranged, now seemed to mock their helplessness. The photograph of John, the stack of books, the half-finished letter on her desk, all reminders of a life interrupted, a presence now defined by absence. Outside, New York moved on, indifferent to the private agony unfolding behind the Arnolds' closed doors. But within, the family was suspended in a state of waiting, each moment stretching into the next, each hope fading into fear. By the second night, the truth could no longer be denied. Dorothy was gone, and with her had gone the certainty that had anchored their lives. The empty room was no longer just a space. It was a question, a wound, a mystery that would haunt the Arnolds for the rest of their days. In the Arnold household, silence was more than the absence of sound. It was a shield, a strategy, a tradition passed down through generations of New York's old money elite. The morning after Dorothy's disappearance, as the city's clamor seeped through the heavy drapes, and the first rays of winter sun glinted off the silver in the breakfast room, the family's world had already begun to tilt. Yet, outwardly, nothing had changed. The servants moved quietly, the clock chimed the hour, and Mary Arnold sat at the table, her teacup trembling ever so slightly in her hand. Francis Arnold, returning from a sleepless night, found his wife in the parlor, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. They spoke in whispers, as if the very walls might betray them. The words "missing" and "Dorothy" hung in the air, heavy with implication, but neither dared to say what they truly feared. To admit panic would be to invite chaos. To speak of scandal would be to give it form. The Arnold social standing was not merely a matter of vanity, it was their currency, their armor against the unpredictable tides of fortune and rumor. In 1910, reputation in New York society was a fragile thing, easily shattered by whispers and headlines. The city's newspapers, always hungry for stories of the rich and unfortunate, would devour any hint of disgrace. A missing daughter, especially one of marriageable age, would be fodder for gossip columns and drawing-room speculation. The Arnolds knew this better than anyone. Francis made his decision swiftly and with the cold pragmatism that had built his business empire. There would be no police, not yet. The authorities, with their blunt questions and public procedures, would only draw attention. Instead, he summoned John S. Keefe, a trusted family lawyer, and explained the situation in terse, measured tones. "Dorothy has not returned home," Francis said, his voice low. "We must find her, but with discretion. The family's name must not be dragged through the mud." Keefe, accustomed to the delicate sensibilities of his clients, nodded gravely. He recommended Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, the most discreet and effective private investigators in the city. Within hours, Two agents arrived at the brownstone, their appearance unremarkable, their manner professional. They were instructed to search quietly. No uniforms, no questions to neighbors, no hint that anything was amiss. Mary Arnold, meanwhile, composed herself with the steely resolve of a woman who had weathered many storms. She instructed the servants to say nothing, to answer no questions, to maintain the routine as if Dorothy might walk through the door at any moment. The staff, loyal and well-trained, obeyed without question, but their eyes betrayed their anxiety. The detectives began their work in silence. They retraced Dorothy's last known steps, visiting Brentano's bookstore and Park and Tilford, questioning clerks and shopkeepers with practiced subtlety. They scoured the city's hospitals and morgues, searching for any trace of a young woman matching Dorothy's description. Each inquiry was made under a false pretense: a missing friend, a business associate, never a daughter of one of New York's most prominent families. At home, the Arnolds maintained a facade of normalcy. Letters were written, invitations accepted and declined, social obligations fulfilled with mechanical precision. But beneath the surface, the family was unraveling. Mary's nerves frayed with each passing hour. Francis grew more withdrawn, his temper flaring at the smallest provocation. The silence between them deepened, filled with unspoken fears and recriminations. Days passed. The private detectives reported back with little to show for their efforts. No one had seen Dorothy after her encounter with Gladys King. No one remembered a young woman in a blue coat and velvet hat boarding a train or entering a hotel. The city, vast and indifferent, had swallowed her whole. The Arnold's silence became a prison. Friends and acquaintances began to notice Dorothy's absence. Their polite inquiries met with vague explanations. She was visiting friends, she was unwell, she was traveling. But rumors have a way of seeping through even the thickest walls. Whispers began to circulate in society circles. Was Dorothy ill? Had she eloped? Was there trouble in the Arnold home? Francis grew increasingly desperate. He authorized the detectives to expand their search, to offer discreet rewards for information, but always with the same instruction: protect the family's name at all costs. The possibility of scandal was unthinkable. In the world of the Arnolds, disgrace was a fate worse than tragedy. Mary, for her part, clung to hope with a ferocity that bordered on denial. She refused to consider the possibility that Dorothy might never return, refused to allow herself to grieve. Instead, she busied herself with the rituals of daily life, her every action a plea for normalcy. She kept Dorothy's room exactly as it had been, the bed made, the curtains drawn, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. But hope, in the absence of answers, became its own kind of torment. Each day without word from Dorothy was a day closer to public revelation, a day closer to the collapse of the carefully constructed world the Arnolds had built. The silence that had once protected them now threatened to destroy them. It was only after weeks of fruitless searching, as the pressure from friends and the press mounted, that Francis reluctantly agreed to involve the police. By then, the trail was cold, the city's memory of Dorothy Arnold already fading. The family's silence, meant to shield them from scandal, had instead ensured that the mystery of Dorothy's disappearance would remain unsolved, a secret locked away behind the doors of their brownstone, whispered about in drawing rooms and parlors for years to come. And so, in the winter of 1910, the Arnolds learned the true cost of silence. It was not just the loss of a daughter, but the loss of certainty, of trust, of the illusion that their name could protect them from the world's chaos. The silence that had once been their refuge became their curse, echoing through the empty halls of their home, a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The Arnold's silence was a fortress, but beyond its walls, the city churned with restless energy in the cold logic of investigation. As the days after Dorothy's disappearance stretched into a week, Francis Arnold's determination to avoid scandal began to yield to the gnawing terror of uncertainty. The Pinkerton detectives, men in plain suits, faces set in professional neutrality, were given their instructions: find Dorothy, but do not breathe a word of the family's involvement to the press or the police. Discretion was paramount. Reputation was everything. Their search began in the city's shadows, far from the gas-lit avenues of the Arnold's world. The detectives moved through the labyrinth of hospitals, checking every ward and charity clinic for a young woman matching Dorothy's description. They visited the city morgue, a grim warren of tiled rooms and cold slabs, where the unclaimed dead awaited identification. Each body was examined, each face compared to the photograph the Arnolds had provided, a studio portrait of Dorothy in happier times, her eyes bright, her expression composed. But none of the nameless women was Dorothy Arnold. The detectives pressed on, their inquiries growing more urgent as the days slipped by. They scoured boarding houses and women's hotels, questioning landlords and chambermaids. Had anyone seen a well-dressed young woman, perhaps traveling under another name? Had anyone noticed a guest who arrived but never left? The answers were always the same. No, no one matching that description, no one who fit the photograph. The city was too vast, its population too transient. Dorothy could have vanished into 1,000 rooms, and no one would be the wiser. Meanwhile, the Arnolds waited in agonized suspense. Each day brought a fresh wave of anonymous tips, letters and telephone calls from strangers claiming to have seen Dorothy in every corner of the city and beyond. Some insisted she had been spotted in Boston or Philadelphia, or even as far away as California. Others claimed she had been seen in the company of a mysterious man, or that she had checked into a hotel under a false name. The detectives followed up each lead, their hopes rising and falling with every inquiry. But every tip led to a dead end. Every sighting proved to be a case of mistaken identity or a cruel prank. The family's lawyer, John Keefe, coordinated the search from the shadows, careful to shield the Arnolds from direct involvement. He advised Frances to keep the household running as usual, to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But inside the brownstone, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Mary Arnold spent her days pacing the halls, her face drawn and pale. Frances grew more irritable, snapping at servants and detectives alike. The servants whispered among themselves, their fear growing with each passing day. The Pinkertons, for all their skill, found themselves stymied by the city's sheer size and anonymity. New York was a place where people disappeared every day, swallowed by its crowds and its secrets. The detectives checked the ferry terminals and train stations, questioning ticket agents and porters. Had anyone seen a young woman traveling alone, perhaps nervous or in distress? The agents shook their heads. So many faces, so many stories. No one stood out. Desperation crept in. The detectives began to consider darker possibilities. They checked the city's rivers, searching for any sign of a body washed ashore. They visited the charity wards and asylums, hoping against hope that Dorothy might have suffered an accident or a breakdown, her memory lost or her will broken. But again, they found nothing. The tips continued to pour in, each one a fresh torment for the family. Some were clearly hoaxes, cruel jokes played by strangers who had read about the case in the papers. Others seemed plausible, at least at first, but collapsed under scrutiny. A woman matching Dorothy's description was seen boarding a train to Chicago, but the passenger turned out to be a traveling saleswoman. Another tip placed her in a Boston boarding house, but the guest was a Canadian tourist. The detectives dutifully reported each failure to the Arnolds, their faces growing grimmer with every meeting. As the days turned into weeks, hope began to wither. The private search, so carefully orchestrated, had yielded nothing but frustration and heartache. The city's vastness had swallowed Dorothy whole, leaving behind only questions in the echo of her absence. The Arnolds, trapped by their own silence, could do nothing but wait and wonder, their world shrinking to the size of a single, empty room. And still, the search continued, quiet, relentless, and, above all, secret. The detectives moved through the city's underbelly, following every lead, chasing every shadow. But Dorothy Arnold was gone, and with her had gone the certainty that the world could be controlled, that reputation could shield against tragedy. The family's silence, once their greatest protection, had become their greatest curse, a barrier not just against scandal, but against the truth. Weeks slipped by in a haze of uncertainty and dread, the days in the Arnold household marked not by the familiar rhythms of society life but by the slow, suffocating passage of time without answers. The private detectives continued their search, but each day that Dorothy remained missing, the walls of discretion the family had so carefully built began to tremble. The city outside was restless, alive with rumor. In drawing rooms and over luncheon tables, the question was whispered: where was Dorothy Arnold? The Arnold silence, once their shield, became a source of suspicion. Dorothy's absence was impossible to hide. Friends called, invitations arrived, and each polite inquiry was met with the same vague reply: she was away, she was unwell, she was visiting friends. But New York's social world was small and tightly woven, where it traveled quickly. The city's newspapers, always hungry for stories of the privileged and the unfortunate, began to sniff at the edges of the mystery. Reporters lingered near the Arnold brownstone, their notebooks ready, their questions pointed. It was the New York Times that first caught wind of the story, a rumor passed along by a servant's cousin or an indiscreet friend. The paper's society columnist made a discreet inquiry, and when the Arnold family refused to comment, the silence itself became news. Within days, the story had spread, first as a whisper, then as a headline. Heiress missing. Dorothy Arnold, daughter of prominent perfume importer, disappears without trace. The city was transfixed. Under the glare of public scrutiny, the Arnold family's resolve began to crack. The pressure was relentless. Letters from strangers offering help or demanding answers, telephone calls at all hours, reporters camped on the stoop, their breath fogging in the winter air. Francis Arnold, who had built his life on control and discretion, found himself besieged by a force he could not manage. The family lawyer, John Keefe, urged him to go to the police. The press will not rest until they have the story, Keefe warned. Better it come from you than from rumor. Reluctantly, Francis agreed. On January 25, 1911, 6 weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, he and Keith walked into the New York Police Department's headquarters on Mulberry Street. The detective assigned to the case was Inspector John F. Hughes, a man known for his tenacity and his discretion. Hughes listened carefully as Francis recounted the events of December 12, omitting nothing but the family's initial silence. He took careful notes, his expression grave. The case exploded into public feel. The NYPD issued a citywide bulletin describing Dorothy in detail: age 25, height 5 feet 4 inches, weight 140 pounds, dark hair, blue eyes, fair complexion. Last seen wearing a blue tailored suit, velvet hat, and sable muff. The newspapers printed her photograph on their front pages, alongside breathless speculation about her fate. The city was captivated. Was it an abduction? A suicide? An elopement gone wrong? The police, unburdened by the need for discretion, launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives canvassed the city, re-interviewing the clerks at Brentano's and Park and Tilford, questioning Dorothy's friends, and searching the parks and rivers for any sign of her. They visited hospitals and morgues, just as the Pinkertons had done, but with the authority of the law behind them. They checked steamship passenger lists and train manifests, searching for any trace of Dorothy traveling under an assumed name. The press, for their part, turned the case into a sensation. Every detail of Dorothy's life was scrutinized and dissected: her education, her literary ambitions, her friendships, her rumored romance with George Griscom Jr. The family's initial silence became a source of scandal, with editorials questioning why the Arnolds had waited so long to involve the police. What have they to hide? One columnist asked pointedly. The public, too, became obsessed. Letters poured in from across the country, some offering prayers, others claiming to have seen Dorothy in distant cities. Amateur sleuths proposed theories, some plausible, most wild. The city's rumor mill churned ceaselessly, and the Arnold family, once the epitome of discretion, found themselves at the center of a storm they could not control. For Francis and Mary Arnold, the ordeal was a nightmare. Their home was besieged by reporters, their every move watched and analyzed. Mary, already fragile, withdrew from society entirely. Francis, his composure shattered, lashed out at the press, at the police, at anyone who dared to suggest that Dorothy's disappearance was anything but an inexplicable tragedy. The involvement of the police changed everything. The case was no longer a private sorrow but a public spectacle, a riddle that captivated and tormented the city. The Arnold silence had protected their reputation for a time, but in the end, it had only deepened the mystery. Now, with the full force of the NYPD and the relentless curiosity of the press focused on their daughter's fate, the family could do nothing but wait and hope that somewhere, in the chaos of the city, a clue would emerge. But as the investigation widened and the weeks dragged on, it became clear that the trail had already grown cold. Dorothy Arnold had vanished into the heart of New York, leaving behind only questions, rumors, and the echo of her last words. "I'm going to walk home through Central Park." The city, for all its energy and ambition, could not bring her back. The city that had once been Dorothy Arnold's playground now became a crucible of rumor, speculation, and mounting scandal. With the police investigation in full swing and the press scenting blood, New York's newspapers transformed Dorothy's disappearance from a private tragedy into a public obsession. For weeks, headlines blared her name above the fold. "Heiress vanishes in broad daylight." "Mystery of the missing socialite." Was it love or foul play? In the absence of answers, the city's imagination ran wild. Reporters, denied access to the family and desperate for fresh angles, began to fill the void with conjecture and innuendo. Theories multiplied like shadows at dusk. Did Dorothy elope with a secret lover, fleeing the suffocating expectations of her family? Was she pregnant, her disappearance an act of desperation to avoid disgrace? Had she run away to Europe, perhaps to join her forbidden suitor, George Griscom Jr., in Italy? Or was she the victim of a crime too terrible to name? The newspapers spared no detail, no matter how salacious or unsubstantiated. They printed Dorothy's photograph or her dark hair, her steady gaze, beside artist renderings of her possible disguises. They published timelines, maps of her last known movements, and interviews with anyone who had ever known her, however briefly. Every scrap of information, every rumor overheard in a tea room or whispered in a club, found its way into print. The speculation was relentless. One day, the world reported that Dorothy had been seen boarding an ocean liner bound for Paris, her identity concealed beneath a veil. The next, the Sun claimed she had been spotted in a Boston boarding house, traveling under an assumed name. The Evening Post ran a series of anonymous letters. "I saw Dorothy Arnold in Philadelphia. She was not alone. She was in trouble. She needed help." The letters, most likely the work of cranks or fortune seekers, only deepened the mystery. For the Arnold family, the onslaught was unbearable. Their brownstone became a fortress besieged. Reporters clustered on the stoop, their breath steaming in the winter air, their questions shouted through the closed door. Photographers lurked across the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of the grieving mother or the stoic father. The telephone rang day and night, strangers offering information for a price, fortune hunters claiming to know Dorothy's fate, spiritualists promising to make contact with her spirit. Inside, the family's world shrank to a series of tense, silent rooms. Mary Arnold, always dignified, now moved like a ghost through her own home, her face drawn and pale, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Francis Arnold, his composure shattered, lashed out at the press, the police, even his own friends. "They're vultures," he told John Keefe, the family lawyer. "They care nothing for the truth, only for the story." But the story was out of their hands. The press dug into every corner of Dorothy's life, exposing her literary ambitions, her failed submissions, her secret romance with Griscom. They published excerpts from her letters, dissected her friendships, speculated on her state of mind. Was she unhappy? Was she planning to leave? Had she confided in anyone? The public devoured every detail, the more lurid the better. The rumors took on a life of their own. Some claimed that Dorothy had been seen in a gambling den on the Lower East Side, her face hidden beneath a hat. Others insisted she had been abducted by white slavers, a favorite bogeyman of the era's yellow journalism. There were stories of secret abortions, of suicide pacts, of double lives led beneath the noses of New York's elite. Each new theory pushed the truth further out of reach. The family, already fractured by grief and uncertainty, began to turn inward. Mary refused to see visitors, her health deteriorating under the strain. Francis grew more irritable, his temper flaring at the smallest provocation. The servants, once invisible, now moved with exaggerated care, fearful of drawing attention. The house, once filled with laughter and light, became a mausoleum of whispered fears and unspoken accusations. Fortune hunters descended on the case, drawn by the promise of reward and notoriety. Private detectives, some legitimate, many not, offered their services for exorbitant fees. Spiritualists and mediums wrote letters, claiming to have received messages from Dorothy on the other side. Some even arrived at the door, demanding to be let in so they could conduct seances in the missing girl's bedroom. The Arnolds, desperate for answers but wary of exploitation, turned most away. As winter deepened, the scandal only grew. The city's social world, always quick to judge, began to distance itself from the Arnolds. Invitations dried up. Friends crossed the street to avoid awkward encounters. The family's name, once synonymous with respectability, now carried a taint of mystery and suspicion. "There is something they are not telling us," society whispered. No girl disappears without a reason. Through it all, Dorothy's fate remained a cipher. The rumors, the headlines, the endless speculation, none brought the family closer to the truth. Each day, the mystery grew more impenetrable, the scandal more corrosive. The Arnolds, once the pillars of New York society, found themselves adrift in a sea of gossip and suspicion, their lives forever changed by the disappearance that refused to be solved. And outside, the city moved on, hungry for the next sensation, the next scandal, the next missing girl. But for the Arnolds, the story would never end. The rumors would linger, a shadow over their name, a question mark that would haunt them to the end of their days. As the search for Dorothy Arnold widened and the city's rumor mill churned, investigators began to piece together the fragments of a life lived partly in shadow. Beneath the surface of Dorothy's carefully curated existence, her poised demeanor, her attendance at teas and luncheons, her dutiful presence at family dinners, there was another story unfolding, one that would come to haunt the investigation and cast a long shadow over the Arnold name. It began, as such stories often do, with a chance meeting in the rarefied circles of New York society. George S. Griscom Jr. was the son of a wealthy Pittsburgh family, a man of means and leisure, known for his charm and, in some quarters, for his lack of direction. He was older than Dorothy, with a reputation that teetered between rakish and unreliable. To the Arnolds, who prized stability and propriety above all, George was an unsuitable match, a threat to the careful future they had envisioned for their daughter. But to Dorothy, George represented something else entirely: possibility, escape, the promise of being seen and cherished for who she truly was, not merely for the family name she carried. Their courtship was conducted in secrecy, a series of furtive meetings and whispered conversations, their affection growing in the shadows where parental eyes could not reach. The relationship deepened quickly, fueled by the intensity of forbidden love and the thrill of defiance. Dorothy and George exchanged letters, dozens of them, sometimes several in a single week, each one a lifeline between their separate worlds. In these letters, Dorothy poured out her heart in a way she could not with anyone else. She wrote of her frustrations, her sense of suffocation, her longing for independence and understanding. George responded with affection, encouragement, and promises of a future together. But the world they inhabited was not so easily defied. In the spring of 1910, Dorothy's parents discovered the romance. The revelation came as a shock, not just for the secrecy, but for the sense of betrayal. How could their daughter, raised with every advantage, risk her future on a man of whom they so thoroughly disapproved? Francis Arnold was particularly incensed. He confronted Dorothy, forbade her from seeing George, and, in a gesture both punitive and desperate, cut off her allowance. The message was clear, and the relationship, or lose the support and standing that came with being an Arnold. Dorothy, caught between love and loyalty, tried to comply. She wrote to George, explaining her parents' objections, her father's anger, her own heartbreak. But the correspondence did not stop. If anything, the distance only intensified their longing. In the fall of 1910, Dorothy secretly traveled to Boston, where George was staying at the time. The visit was brief, but it was enough to rekindle their hopes and deepen their resolve. The letters from this period are filled with longing and pain. Dorothy writes, "I am so tired of it all, George, so tired of pretending, of living a life that is not my own. If only we could be together, away from all this." George replies with reassurances, "Be patient, my darling. We will find a way. I cannot imagine my life without you." The letters are also tinged with fear, fear of discovery, of disgrace, of the future that seemed always just out of reach. Investigators, combing through Dorothy's belongings after her disappearance, found these letters hidden in a locked drawer. The discovery was both illuminating and troubling. Here was a motive, perhaps, for Dorothy's vanishing, a secret love, a forbidden relationship, a desire to escape the confines of her family and society. But the letters also raised new questions. Had Dorothy run away to join George? Had she confided in him her plans? Or had the heartbreak and pressure become too much to bear? The police, under pressure from the press and the public, tracked George Griscom Jr. to Florence, Italy, where he was staying with his mother. They cabled him, demanding answers. George's replies were evasive, his tone defensive. He insisted he had not seen Dorothy since their meeting in Boston, that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts, that he was as distraught as anyone over her disappearance. But the investigators were not convinced. They pressed him for details, for any clue that might explain Dorothy's fate. George's letters, when made public, became fodder for the newspapers. The press seized on the story of forbidden love, of parental disapproval, of a young woman torn between duty and desire. The speculation was relentless. Had Dorothy eloped with George, slipping away to Europe under an assumed name? Had she been abandoned, her hopes dashed, her spirit broken? Or was there something darker at play, a secret so devastating that it could only end in tragedy? For the Arnolds, the revelation of Dorothy's secret romance was a second blow, compounding their grief with shame and confusion. Francis Arnold, already reeling from the loss of his daughter, now faced the public airing of his family's private struggles. Mary Arnold, her health failing, retreated further into herself, unable to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the passionate, yearning woman revealed in the letters. The city, for its part, was captivated. The story of Dorothy Arnold and George Griscom Jr. became a cautionary tale, a parable of love and loss, of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of respectability. But for those who knew Dorothy best, the letters were a testament to her vulnerability, her courage, and the impossible choices she had been forced to make. In the end, the secret romance was just one more thread in the tangled web of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance. A clue that promised answers but delivered only more questions, a love story without a conclusion, a heartbreak that echoed through the empty rooms of the Arnold home and the city that had swallowed her whole. As the weeks dragged on and the mystery of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance deepened, the search for answers stretched far beyond New York's crowded streets. The city's rumor mills had already spun tales of elopement, secret shame, and scandal. But one theory began to gain traction both in the press and among investigators. Dorothy had fled the country. The so-called Europe theory was fueled by whispers of clandestine romance and the tantalizing possibility that the missing heiress had slipped away to join her forbidden love, George Griscom Jr. Griscom, the scion of a wealthy Pittsburgh family, had been abroad when Dorothy vanished. His name, already notorious in the Arnold household, now became a focal point for suspicion. The press seized on the story. Griscom, it was reported, had been vacationing in Italy with his mother, far from the prying eyes of New York society. Was it coincidence, or had Dorothy arranged to meet him there, escaping the suffocating expectations of her family and the relentless gaze of her peers? The detectives, under mounting pressure from both the NYPD and the Arnold family, cabled their counterparts in Italy. Griscom was located in Florence, staying at a grand hotel overlooking the Arno. His days spent among expatriates and art galleries, his nights a mystery. When the American investigators arrived, they found him composed but wary, his answers measured and precise. The questioning was formal, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Had he seen Dorothy? Had she written to him, or tried to contact him since her disappearance? Did he know anything at all, about her whereabouts? Griscom denied everything. He had not seen Dorothy since their meeting in Boston months before. He had received no letters, no telegrams, no secret messages. He expressed concern, even sorrow, at her fate, but his tone was distant, his manner guarded. The detectives pressed him, their questions circling ever closer to the heart of the matter. Why had he come to Italy at this particular time? Was he aware of the rumors that Dorothy had been seen boarding a ship to Europe? Did he know of any plans she might have made to join him? Griscom's answers grew more evasive. He insisted that his presence in Florence was merely a coincidence, that he had no knowledge of Dorothy's intentions. He offered up his travel documents, his hotel receipts, anything to prove his innocence. Yet the investigators were not convinced. Griscom's defensiveness, his reluctance to volunteer details, only stoked their suspicions. They noted the careful way he chose his words, the way he avoided meeting their eyes. Was he hiding something, or simply weary of being hounded by questions he could not answer? The detectives left Florence with more questions than they had arrived with, their doubts unresolved. Back in New York, the press devoured every scrap of information from Europe. Headlines speculated wildly. Did Dorothy Arnold flee to Italy? Griscom questioned in Florence, denies all knowledge. The public imagination ran riot, filling in the gaps with stories of secret rendezvous, midnight departures, and coded letters smuggled across the Atlantic. For the Arnold family, the Europe theory was both a torment and a fragile hope. If Dorothy had indeed run away to join George, then perhaps she was alive, perhaps she would return. But the silence from Florence was deafening. No letters arrived, no clues emerged. The family's private detectives scoured passenger lists, cabled consulates, and tracked down every rumor of a young American woman traveling alone or under an assumed name. Each lead dissolved into nothing. The suspicion that Griscom knew more than he admitted lingered, casting a shadow over every new development. Was he protecting Dorothy, shielding her from the consequences of her flight? Or was he, as some whispered, complicit in a darker fate? The answers remained elusive, lost in the fog of distance and denial. In the end, the Europe theory became just another layer in the mystery of Dorothy Arnold, a tantalizing possibility that promised resolution but delivered only more uncertainty. The image of Dorothy, stepping onto a ship beneath the cover of night, bound for a new life in a foreign land, haunted the city's imagination. But as the weeks turned into months, and the trail grew ever colder, it became clear that if Dorothy had indeed crossed the ocean, she had left her old life, and all hope of discovery, far behind. The city's appetite for answers had become ravenous, and as the weeks turned to months with no sign of Dorothy Arnold, a new and somber theory began to take root in the public mind, a theory that whispered through the corridors of the press, echoed in the drawing rooms of high society, and weighed heavily in the private conversations of the Arnold family: suicide. It was a theory born of humiliation and heartbreak. Dorothy's secret failures as a writer, her stories returned unopened, her essays rejected by the very magazines she longed to conquer, were now public knowledge, dissected in the newspapers with a kind of clinical cruelty. The press reprinted passages from her letters, speculated on her state of mind, and painted a portrait of a young woman crushed beneath the burden of her own ambitions. Was the disappointment too much for Miss Arnold? One columnist mused. Did she, in a moment of despair, seek oblivion rather than return home in disgrace? The forbidden romance with George Griscom Jr. only deepened the shadows. The public, already primed to believe the worst, seized on the notion that Dorothy's love had been her undoing. Her parents' disapproval, the forced separation, the clandestine letters, all became evidence in the court of rumor. Some said she had been seen wandering the snowy paths of Central Park that afternoon, her expression distant, her steps uncertain. Others claimed she had been spotted near the edge of the Hudson, gazing out over the icy water as dusk fell. The police, pressed by the public and the press, scoured the city's parks and rivers. They searched the frozen banks of the Hudson and the East River, dragged the ponds of Central Park, and checked every hospital and morgue for a woman matching Dorothy's description. Each day brought fresh reports of unidentified bodies pulled from the water, each one examined with grim thoroughness. But none were Dorothy. No coat, no hat, no telltale sign of the missing heiress was ever found. In the absence of a body, the suicide theory remained just that, a theory, haunting in its plausibility and its lack of closure. The Arnolds, for all their desire to protect their daughter's reputation, could not ignore the possibility. Francis Arnold, in rare moments of candor, admitted as much to the detectives. She was sensitive, he said quietly. She took her disappointments hard. I fear she may have done herself harm. Yet hope, however faint, lingered. The city was too vast, its secrets too many for certainty. The absence of a body became both a torment and a strange comfort. Without proof, the possibility remained that Dorothy was still alive, somewhere beyond the reach of scandal and sorrow. The family clung to this hope, even as the world around them seemed determined to believe the worst. The suicide theory, for all its darkness, was a reflection of the era's anxieties, a time when women's ambitions were often stifled, when failure was a private shame, and when the boundaries of respectability were both a shield and a prison. Dorothy's story became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers that awaited those who dared to dream beyond the limits set for them. But for those who loved her, the theory was an agony without end. The unanswered question, did she choose to disappear, or was she lost to despair, would haunt the Arnold family for the rest of their days. And in the city that had swallowed her whole, Dorothy Arnold's absence became a presence, a mystery that refused to be laid to rest. With Dorothy Arnold's disappearance now a national sensation, the Arnold family found themselves not only besieged by reporters and detectives, but also by a darker, more predatory element. The opportunists and blackmailers who thrive in the shadows of tragedy. The first ransom note arrived just days after the story broke in the press, a crudely written letter postmarked from Brooklyn, its words jagged and urgent. If you ever want to see your daughter alive, leave $5,000 in small bills at the corner of 59th and Madison. No police. No tricks. Francis Arnold read the note in silence, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. Mary, already frayed by grief and exhaustion, broke down in tears. The family's lawyer, John Keith, examined the letter and advised caution. The police were notified, and detectives staked out the designated corner, watching every passerby with suspicion. But the night passed uneventfully, no one came to collect the money, and no sign of Dorothy appeared. It was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the Arnolds received a steady stream of similar letters, each promising information or Dorothy's safe return in exchange for money. Some were elaborate, detailing supposed sightings or secret handoffs. Others were brief, almost taunting in their cruelty. One claimed Dorothy was being held in a tenement on the Lower East Side, another that she had been taken to New Jersey. A few demanded larger sums, $10,000 or more, threatening dire consequences if the family involved the police. Each letter was investigated with grim diligence. Detectives followed every lead, sometimes arranging for the ransom to be paid under police surveillance. But each time, the result was the same. No one appeared to collect the money, and no credible evidence surfaced. Some letters were obvious hoaxes, the work of pranksters or the desperate poor seeking a quick windfall. Others bore the hallmarks of professional blackmailers, their language cold and transactional. All were ultimately dismissed as cruel distractions, deepening the family's agony. The press, eager for new developments, reported on the ransom notes with breathless excitement. Headlines screamed of heiress held for ransom, and Arnold's tormented by kidnappers. The public, already captivated by the case, now imagined Dorothy trapped in a cellar or smuggled across state lines, her fate in the hands of faceless criminals. But behind the headlines, the truth was more mundane and more devastating. The letters were a symptom of the case's notoriety, not a clue to its solution. Each one was a dead end, another twist in a labyrinth with no exit. The double life hypothesis. As the ransom notes faded and the weeks turned into months, a new theory began to take hold, a theory that suggested Dorothy Arnold had not been taken, but had chosen to disappear. The double life hypothesis, as the newspapers dubbed it, was fueled by a series of tantalizing but ultimately unverified sightings across the country. Reports trickled in from Boston, Philadelphia, and even as far as San Francisco. In each case, someone claimed to have seen a young woman matching Dorothy's description, a tall, well-dressed brunette, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of a man. In Boston, a hotel clerk swore that Dorothy had checked in under an assumed name, only to vanish the next morning. In Philadelphia, a shopgirl claimed to have recognized her in a crowded department store, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. In California, a private detective insisted he had seen Dorothy boarding a streetcar, her manner nervous and furtive. The possibility that Dorothy had orchestrated her own disappearance was both alluring and agonizing. The press speculated endlessly. Had she grown weary of her family's expectations and the suffocating conventions of society? Was she living under a new identity, free at last to pursue her literary ambitions or her forbidden romance? Or was she simply lost, adrift in a country that had no place for women who refused to conform? The Arnold family, desperate for hope, clung to each new report, dispatching detectives to investigate. But every lead evaporated under scrutiny. The hotel guest in Boston turned out to be a traveling saleswoman. The Philadelphia sighting was a case of mistaken identity. The woman in San Francisco was a local schoolteacher, her resemblance to Dorothy purely coincidental. Each investigation ended the same way, with disappointment, with the ache of hope deferred. Yet the theory persisted, fueled by the era's fascination with reinvention and escape. America was a land of second chances, of cities where a person could vanish and begin anew. The idea that Dorothy Arnold, stifled by privilege and heartbreak, might have seized that chance captured the public imagination. The newspapers ran stories of other women who had disappeared and reappeared years later, their past erased, their future self-made. But for the Arnolds, the double life hypothesis was a double-edged sword. It offered the faintest glimmer that Dorothy might still be alive, somewhere out there, living on her own terms. But it also meant accepting that she had chosen to leave them behind, to erase herself from their lives. It was a hope laced with heartbreak, a mystery that deepened with every passing day. And so, as the years slipped by, the ransom notes and false sightings faded into memory, replaced by a silence that was, in its own way, even more cruel. The question of Dorothy Arnold's fate remained unanswered, a riddle with no solution, a life suspended between rumor and reality, forever lost in the shadows of a city that had swallowed her whole. As the months slipped by and the mystery of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance remained stubbornly unsolved, the Arnold family began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty, shame, and relentless public scrutiny. Their once proud brownstone on East 79th Street, a symbol of old New York's privilege and respectability, became a fortress of silence and sorrow, a place where hope flickered and died in the shadowy corners of every room. Francis Arnold, the family patriarch, was a man transformed by loss. In the early days, he had clung to the routines and rituals that had always defined his world. Business meetings, society dinners, the quiet authority of his study. But as weeks turned to months and every lead evaporated, Francis's composure gave way to obsession. He poured his fortune into the search for Dorothy, hiring new detectives, offering ever larger rewards, funding private investigations that spanned the continent and crossed the Atlantic. He cabled consulates in Europe, paid informants in distant cities, and demanded daily updates from Pinkerton agents in the NYPD alike. His days became a blur of interviews, strategy sessions, and anxious pacing. He read every letter, every anonymous tip, Every wild-eyed claim that Dorothy had been seen in Boston, Philadelphia, or San Francisco. No expense was spared, no possibility dismissed. At night, Francis would sit alone in the parlor, staring into the fire, replaying every moment of Dorothy's last day, searching for the detail he might have missed, the clue that would bring his daughter home. But with each passing week, the search yielded only more questions, more dead ends. The city's vastness mocked his efforts. The world beyond New York was even more indifferent. Francis's obsession, once fueled by hope, curdled into bitterness and rage. He lashed out at detectives, at the press, at anyone who dared suggest that Dorothy might never be found. His business suffered, his friendships withered, and his reputation, so carefully built over a lifetime, began to erode under the relentless glare of scandal. Mary Arnold, meanwhile, was slowly undone by grief and shame. The loss of her daughter was a wound that never healed, a constant ache that colored every moment of her day. She withdrew from society, refusing invitations, declining visits, and shunning even her closest friends. The drawing room, once the scene of lively teas and musical evenings, grew quiet and dim. Mary spent hours in Dorothy's bedroom, sitting on the edge of the untouched bed, tracing her fingers over the spines of her daughter's books, breathing in the faint scent of lavender and ink that lingered in the air. Her health, already delicate, began to fail. She suffered from insomnia, headaches, and bouts of nervous exhaustion. The family doctor visited often, prescribing tonics and rest, but nothing could ease the burden Mary carried. She was haunted by guilt. Had she missed some sign, some cry for help? Had her insistence on propriety and reputation driven Dorothy away? The questions gnawed at her, unanswerable and unrelenting. The household itself reflected the family's unraveling. The servants moved quietly, their footsteps muffled, their voices hushed. Meals were taken in silence, the clatter of silverware echoing in the cavernous dining room. John, Dorothy's younger brother, returned from Harvard for the holidays but found himself adrift in a home transformed by absence. The laughter and warmth of his childhood were gone, replaced by a tension that thickened the air and made every conversation a minefield. Outside, the world moved on. The press, once obsessed with the case, found new scandals to pursue. The city's social elite, always wary of association with tragedy, began to distance themselves from the Arnolds. Invitations dwindled, polite inquiries faded into awkward silence. The family, once at the center of New York society, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly fortune and respectability could be undone. Francis's obsession with the search became a point of contention within the family. Mary, exhausted and broken, pleaded with him to let go, to accept that Dorothy might never return. But Francis would not stop. The search was all he had left, the only thing that gave shape to the endless days and sleepless nights. He spent a fortune, tens of thousands of dollars, a staggering sum for the time, on detectives, advertisements, and rewards. He mortgaged property, liquidated investments, and neglected his business to fund the hunt for answers. The strain fractured the marriage that had once seemed unassailable. Francis and Mary, united for decades by duty and shared ambition, now found themselves separated by grief. Their conversations grew terse, their silences longer. Each blamed themselves, and, in unspoken ways, each other for Dorothy's fate. The home that had once been a sanctuary became a place of accusation and regret. As the years passed, the Arnold family faded from public view. Their fortune diminished, their social standing eroded, and their hearts remained broken. The search for Dorothy, once a crusade, became a private torment, a ghost that haunted every room, every memory, every hope for the future. And through it all, Dorothy's absence remained a wound that would never heal, a reminder of the fragility of happiness, the cruelty of fate, and the terrible price of secrets left unspoken. The years slipped by, and with them the fevered headlines, the crowds of reporters, the clamor of the city's curiosity. The world moved on, as it always does, and the name Dorothy Arnold gradually faded from the front pages, first to the inside columns, then to the occasional "Where are they now?" feature, and finally to the realm of whispered legend. But inside the Arnold home, time did not heal. It only deepened the ache of absence. Frances and Mary Arnold never gave up hope, not truly. The search that had begun with frantic telegrams and private detectives became, over the years, a quieter, more desperate ritual. Francis, his hair turned silver and his back stooped by grief, still kept a file of every letter, every newspaper clipping, every anonymous tip. Mary, her health broken by sorrow, would sit for hours in Dorothy's untouched room, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window, as if expecting her daughter to appear at any moment on the stoop below. Occasionally, the phone would ring or a letter would arrive, always from a stranger, always with the same tantalizing promise. I saw your daughter in Boston. A woman matching Dorothy's description is living in a boarding house in Philadelphia. She was spotted working as a governess in California. Each report was a spark of hope, a fresh agony. Francis would dispatch detectives or write back for more details, his heart pounding with the old, familiar mixture of dread and longing. But each time, the answer was the same: mistaken identity, a cruel hoax, or a dead end. The city's memory of Dorothy Arnold faded, but for her family, she was everywhere and nowhere. The empty chair at the dinner table, the unopened letters on her desk, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hall. These were the daily reminders of a life interrupted. Mary clung to small rituals. She kept Dorothy's room just as it had been, dusted her books, and laid fresh flowers on her writing desk. Francis, for all his outward stoicism, was haunted by guilt and regret. He replayed their last conversation in his mind, searching for some sign, some clue he had missed. The world outside continued to change. The city grew taller, noisier, more indifferent. New scandals and mysteries captured the public's imagination, and Dorothy's story became a cautionary tale, a ghost story mothers told their daughters. But every so often, a new report would surface. A woman seen in a distant city, a letter signed with Dorothy's initials, a rumor of a secret life lived under another name. Each time, the Arnolds would hope, and each time, they would be disappointed. Friends and relatives, once so eager to help, grew silent and distant. The family's social circle shrank, invitations dwindled. The Arnold name, once a mark of distinction, became associated with tragedy and unanswered questions. The servants, too, moved on, replaced by new faces who knew Dorothy only as a photograph on the mantelpiece. For Francis and Mary, hope became both a comfort and a torment. They could not let go, could not accept the finality of loss without proof. The unanswered calls, those fleeting, unconfirmed reports, kept the wound open, kept the possibility alive that Dorothy might one day return, changed but alive. As the years stretched into decades, the hope that had once sustained them became a quiet, persistent ache, a shadow that never left. And so the Arnold home remained suspended in time, a monument to love and longing, to the questions that would never be answered. Dorothy's disappearance became part of the city's folklore, her fate a riddle that haunted New York long after the headlines faded. For her family, every ring of the telephone, every letter from a stranger, was a reminder that some mysteries are never solved, that some daughters, once lost, are never truly found. As the years stretched on and the trail grew colder, Dorothy Arnold's disappearance became less a case to be solved and more a riddle to be pondered. The city's fascination with the vanished heiress never truly faded. It simply evolved, shifting from frantic search to endless speculation. In parlors and police stations, in the offices of detectives and the pages of newspapers, the question was asked again and again: what happened to Dorothy Arnold? The experts, detectives, journalists, psychologists, and amateur sleuths assembled the facts and found them wanting. There was no body, no confession, no trace of Dorothy beyond that bright December day in 1910. The absence of evidence became its own kind of presence, a void that drew theories like moss to a flame. Was it suicide? Some pointed to Dorothy's secret heartbreaks, The string of rejected manuscripts, the clandestine romance with George Griscom Jr., the weight of her family's expectations. The humiliation of her literary failures had become public knowledge, dissected in the press with merciless detail. Her letters, unearthed after her disappearance, spoke of loneliness and despair. Could she have taken her own life, slipping into the icy waters of the Hudson or the shadowy depths of Central Park, her body lost to the city's vastness? Yet, despite exhaustive searches of every park, river, and hospital, no trace of Dorothy was ever found. The lack of a body haunted this theory, making it both plausible and incomplete. Was it foul play? Others believed Dorothy had met with violence. New York in 1910 was a city of sharp contrasts, glittering wealth and grinding poverty, grand avenues and dangerous alleys. Could she have fallen victim to a predator, attacked as she walked home through Central Park, or lured away by someone she trusted? The city's underworld was rife with stories of abductions and disappearances, and the press was quick to draw parallels. Yet, again, there was no evidence, no witnesses, no struggle, no ransom successfully paid. The blackmail letters that had tormented the Arnolds were all proven hoaxes, and every supposed sighting or clue led nowhere. Did she orchestrate her own disappearance? The most tantalizing theory was that Dorothy had chosen to vanish, to shed the suffocating skin of her old life and begin anew. The double life hypothesis gained traction with every unconfirmed sighting. A woman matching Dorothy's description seen in Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco. Some imagined her living under an assumed name, working as a writer or governess, free at last from her family's expectations. The America of the early 20th century was a place where reinvention was possible, where a woman with means and determination could disappear and start over. But each lead, when investigated, dissolved into disappointment. No one could prove that Dorothy had survived, much less thrived, in a new life. Was George Griscom Jr. involved? Suspicion lingered around Dorothy's secret suitor, the wealthy but disreputable George Griscom Jr. His evasiveness when questioned in Italy, his history of clandestine correspondence, and his family's own wealth and influence all fueled speculation. Did he know more than he admitted? Had Dorothy tried to join him abroad, only to meet with disaster along the way? Or was he, too, simply a victim of circumstance, his name forever linked to a mystery he could not solve? Other suspects and wild theories. In the vacuum of evidence, wilder theories flourished. Some whispered of secret pregnancies and botched abortions, of blackmail and betrayal, of white slavery and international intrigue. The city's imagination, stoked by the press, conjured every possibility, each more dramatic than the last. Yet, for all the speculation, no one could point to a single suspect, a single motive, or a single piece of hard evidence. The haunting absence of proof. What made Dorothy Arnold's case so chilling, so enduring, was not just the tragedy of a young woman lost, but the utter lack of closure. Every theory was plausible, yet none could be proven. Every suspect was possible, yet none could be charged. The city, for all its resources and energy, could not bring Dorothy home. The years passed, and the mystery only deepened. The Arnold family, once so prominent, faded into obscurity, their fortune spent, and their hearts broken. The detectives retired or died, their case files gathering dust in forgotten archives. The public moved on to new scandals, new disappearances, new mysteries. But Dorothy's story lingered, a question mark in the city's history, a shadow that never quite faded. In the end, the lack of evidence was as haunting as the possibilities themselves. Dorothy Arnold had walked out into the bright winter morning and vanished, leaving behind only questions. Was she a victim of her own despair, of another's violence, or of her own longing for freedom? The world would never know. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest answer of all. The Arnold brownstone stood on East 79th Street, its dignified facade unchanged, its windows reflecting the seasons as they turned from winter's icy hush to spring's tentative warmth and back again. But to those who passed by, the house was no longer just another monument to old money and social aspiration. It had become a symbol, an address whispered about in the drawing rooms of the Upper East Side, a place where the city's endless hunger for stories of tragedy and privilege had come to rest. For years after Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, a shadow clung to the home, as real and persistent as the soot that settled on the stone. Neighbors, once eager to exchange pleasantries with Mary Arnold on her way to market, or to tip their hats to Francis as he left for his office, now crossed the street rather than risk an encounter. They spoke in lowered voices, glancing up at the curtained windows, speculating about what secrets might still be hidden inside. Some said the Arnolds were cursed, others that they were simply unlucky. A few, more cynical, wondered aloud what the family had done to invite such misfortune. No girl disappears without a reason, they would say, their words trailing off into silence. The brownstone itself seemed to absorb the grief of its inhabitants. The curtains, once drawn back to let in the morning sun, now remained closed. The laughter and music that had once spilled from the parlor were replaced by the muffled sounds of footsteps and the occasional cry that escaped Mary's lips when she thought she was alone. The servants moved quietly, their faces drawn, their conversations hushed. The house had become a mausoleum of memory, each room haunted by the absence of the daughter who had vanished so completely. Yet, outside the Arnold home, the city moved on. Fifth Avenue bustled with carriages and automobiles, the shops filled with new fashions in the latest imported luxuries. Children played in Central Park, their shouts echoing off the stone walls of the Metropolitan Museum. The world did not pause for Dorothy Arnold. New scandals, new tragedies, and new fortunes rose to take her place in the city's imagination. Still, the mystery lingered. Every so often, a stranger would pause before the Arnold house, gazing up at the windows as if expecting to see Dorothy herself, older now but unmistakable, peering out at the world she had left behind. The story of her disappearance became part of the city's folklore, a cautionary tale told at dinner parties and recounted in the society columns whenever another young woman went missing. "Remember Dorothy Arnold," they would say, as if her name alone could ward off the darkness. Inside the house, the family tried to carry on. Francis Arnold maintained the routines of his business, but his heart was no longer in it. Mary, frail and diminished, clung to the hope that Dorothy might one day return, for every waking moment a negotiation between despair and denial. The empty bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to the girl who had once filled it with laughter and dreams. The shadow over Fifth Avenue was not just the absence of Dorothy Arnold, but the presence of all that remained unsaid and unresolved. It was the weight of questions that could never be answered, the ache of hope that refused to die. The city, for all its energy and ambition, could not dispel the darkness that had settled over the Arnold family. Their home, once a beacon of respectability and success, became a silent testament to the fragility of happiness and the enduring power of mystery. And so, as the years passed and the world changed, the story of Dorothy Arnold remained, a shadow stretching across Fifth Avenue, a reminder that some secrets are never revealed and some losses never fade. In the years after Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, her name became more than a headline or a whispered curiosity. It became a warning, a parable retold in the parlors and drawing rooms of New York's elite. The story of the vanished heiress, once the subject of frantic searches and fevered speculation, settled into the city's collective memory as a lesson written in absence and uncertainty. For the privileged families of Manhattan, Dorothy's fate was a chilling reminder that wealth and reputation were no armor against the shadows. Mothers invoked her name when cautioning their daughters about the perils of city life, about the dangers that could slip past locked doors and careful chaperones. "Remember Dorothy Arnold," they would say, as if her story alone could keep them safe from the unknown. Her photograph, once a symbol of youth and promise, became a ghostly presence in society columns, her smile frozen in time, her fate a question mark that hovered over every debutante season. The city's social world, so quick to judge and so eager to protect its own, was forced to confront the limits of its power. The Arnolds had done everything right: education, connections, propriety, and yet none of it could bring their daughter home. The drawing rooms that once buzzed with gossip about new fortunes and old scandals now echoed with a quieter, more anxious refrain. If it could happen to the Arnolds, It could happen to anyone. Dorothy's vanishing exposed the cracks in the gilded facade of privilege. It revealed how easily a life could be lost amid the city's crowds, how quickly secrets could fester beneath a veneer of respectability. The press, ever hungry for sensation, seized on the story as a cautionary tale for the modern age, a warning that even the best families harbored hidden sorrows, that even the brightest daughters could slip away, unseen and unprotected. In the years that followed, her case was invoked whenever another young woman went missing, whenever rumors of scandal threatened to upend the social order. She became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that beneath the silks and pearls, beneath the rituals of tea and charity, there lay a world of longing, disappointment, and risk. The city's mothers grew more watchful, its daughters more wary. The lesson of Dorothy Arnold was not easily forgotten. Within the Arnold home, the legacy was more personal, more painful. Frances and Mary Arnold, once fixtures of New York society, lived out their days in the shadow of their loss. Their fortune diminished. Their circle of friends shrunk to those few who could bear to share in their sorrow. The empty room, the untouched books, the unanswered letters, all became relics of a life interrupted, a future stolen by forces they could never name. But outside, in the city that had once swallowed her whole, Dorothy's story endured. It was told and retold, embellished and analyzed, each generation finding in it new meanings, new warnings. For some, she was a victim of her own ambition, a casualty of a world that offered women too few choices. For others, she was a symbol of the dangers that lurked just beyond the reach of privilege, a reminder that money and status could not buy safety or certainty. And so, Dorothy Arnold's disappearance became a part of New York's mythology, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of high society, a shadow that lingered long after the headlines faded. Her legacy was not just one of loss, but of revelation, a story that exposed the fragility of happiness, the limits of control, and the enduring mystery at the heart of every family, no matter how privileged or protected. Decades passed. The city changed, growing taller and louder, its skyline a jagged script of ambition and possibility. The horse-drawn carriages of Dorothy Arnold's day gave way to roaring automobiles, then to the endless stream of yellow cabs and buses that pulsed up and down Fifth Avenue. The fashion shifted, the fortunes rose and fell, and the old brownstones of the Upper East Side were slowly swallowed by the march of time. Yet, in the quiet corners of New York's collective memory, the name Dorothy Arnold never truly faded. Her story became a ghost story, a caution whispered by mothers to daughters, a riddle that outlived the generation who had known her. The brownstone on East 79th Street stood for years as a monument to absence, its windows reflecting the seasons, its rooms echoing with the footsteps of a family forever marked by loss. Neighbors came and went, the city's rhythms continued, but the shadow of Dorothy's vanishing lingered, a silent question that no one could answer. For the Arnolds, the passing years brought no peace. Frances Arnold died with the search still burning in his heart, his fortune depleted by private detectives and fruitless leads. Mary Arnold's health never recovered. She faded quietly, her last thoughts haunted by the hope that her daughter might still return, that the next letter, the next telephone call, might finally bring news. Their son John, grown and burdened by the family's sorrow, carried the weight of the mystery into his own adulthood, never speaking of it except in hushed tones, as if to name it was to invite its curse. The city moved on. New scandals, new tragedies, new disappearances filled the headlines. But every so often, a journalist would revisit the case, piecing together the yellowed clippings and faded photographs, marveling at the utter lack of resolution. Theories were revived and discarded. Suicide, abduction, voluntary escape, murder. Each was plausible. None could be proven. The absence of evidence was as chilling as any answer. Dorothy's fate became a cipher, her life a story told in negatives, not found, not seen, not returned. The parks and rivers yielded no trace. The hospitals and morgues offered only strangers. The ransom notes and blackmail letters proved to be cruel hoaxes. The sightings in distant cities evaporated, one by one, under the harsh light of investigation. Even the tantalizing possibility of a new life, lived under another name, faded as the years passed and Dorothy's face became just another photograph in the archives. Yet the mystery endured. In the city's folklore, Dorothy Arnold became a symbol, a reminder that even in a world of privilege and power, some doors, once closed, are never opened again. Her story was retold in novels and plays, her name invoked whenever another young woman vanished without a trace. She haunted the city's imagination, a figure glimpsed in the crowd, forever 25, forever walking home through Central Park on a winter's afternoon. For historians and true crime enthusiasts, the case remains one of New York's most enduring enigmas. The files are still studied, the letters still read, the timelines still reconstructed. Each new generation of detectives and writers believes, for a moment, that they might be the one to solve it, to find the missing piece, the overlooked clue, the answer that has eluded everyone else. But the silence persists, as impenetrable as the city itself. In the end, Dorothy Arnold's story is not just a tale of loss, but a meditation on the nature of mystery. It is a reminder that some questions are never answered, some wounds never healed. The city that swallowed her whole continues to pulse and change, indifferent to the sorrows of the past, but the shadow of her absence remains, a silent echo in the heart of New York. And so, the fate of Dorothy Arnold endures, not as a solved crime, not as a closed chapter, but as an unsolved silence. She is the girl who vanished, the daughter who never came home, the question that lingers in the winter air, long after the world is moved on.